Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness carry the greatest consequences. For a man who has lost everything, offering a stranger a drink might seem like nothing, but it can change the course of his entire life. In a frozen northern village, Bjorn sits alone in the mead-hall, his warrior days behind him. When a mysterious woman enters seeking shelter, he does what any decent man would do. He offers her ale without asking for anything in return. She calls herself Svala, a wandering shieldmaiden with fierce eyes and secrets she keeps hidden. But Bjorn doesn't know that this simple gesture of kindness has caught the attention of someone far more powerful than he could imagine. She's not just any warrior woman, and her true identity will turn his quiet life upside down. What happens when an old soldier discovers the woman he helped is worth more than entire kingdoms? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled like a wounded beast across the fjords of Nordmark, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of another harsh winter. Snow clung to the eaves of weathered longhouses, their timber walls darkened by countless seasons of ice and flame. In this forgotten corner of the north, where the old ways still held sway and men were measured by the steadiness of their word rather than the weight of their purse, Bjorn Ironshield had found what he believed would be his final resting place. Death not yet, but something perhaps more difficult for a man who had once commanded the respect of jarls and the fear of enemies. Obscurity, the kind of slow fade that comes to warriors who outlive their wars. Their purpose, their relevance in a world that had moved on without them. Bjorn S. hands, scarred and weathered as old oak, wrapped around a horn of ale as he sat in his customary corner of Olaf's mead-hall. The ancient drinking vessel had seen better days, its carved surface worn smooth by countless hands, its rim chipped from years of honest use. Like everything else in this place, it bore the marks of time and service without complaint. The horn had belonged to his father, and his father's father before that, a simple thing, but one that carried the weight of generations. The hall itself breathed with the warmth of community and the comfort of ritual. Thick timber beams, blackened by decades of hearth smoke, stretched overhead like the ribs of some great slumbering beast. The walls were adorned with shields and weapons, not for display but ready for use should the need arise. A fire crackled in the central pit, casting dancing shadows that seemed to bring life to the carved faces of long-dead heroes etched into the wooden posts. This was where Bjorn spent his evenings now, nursing his ale and his memories in equal measure. The other patrons knew him well enough to nod respectfully when he entered, but they gave him the solitude he seemed to crave. They remembered when his name had meant something, when young men would cross provinces just to serve under his command, when his battle-worn shield had been a banner of hope on blood-soaked fields. That shield now hung on the wall of his modest dwelling, its iron boss dented, its wooden face scarred by sword cuts and axe blows. Each mark told a story of survival, of victories won and brothers lost. But it had been 5 winters since he'd lifted it in anger. 5 winters since anyone had called him to war. The world had grown quieter, or perhaps he had simply grown older. The effect was much the same. Bjorn*s reflection was interrupted by the creak of the great door and a sudden gust of frigid air that made the fire hiss and spark. Every head in the hall turned toward the entrance, for visitors were rare in this season, and strangers rarer still. What they saw defied easy explanation. The woman who entered moved with the fluid grace of a hunting cat, her presence commanding. Attention without effort or artifice. She was tall for her kind, with shoulders that spoke of strength earned through action rather than inherited through bloodline. Her hair, the color of burnished copper, was braided in the warrior's fashion, and adorned with small silver trinkets that caught the firelight like fallen stars. Her cloak, thick with fur and rich with dyes that spoke of distant lands, was pinned at the shoulder with a brooch of intricate workmanship. But it was her eyes that marked her as something extraordinary. They were the color of winter storms, grey-blue and fierce, and they held an intelligence that seemed to weigh and measure everything they touched. When her gaze swept the hall, conversations died mid-sentence. When it lingered, grown men found reasons to look away. She called herself Svala when old Olaf approached to offer hospitality, her voice carrying the crisp authority of one accustomed to being obeyed. She spoke their dialect with the Polish of education, yet underneath ran a current of something wilder, something that belonged to wind-swept heights and the call of ravens. "I seek shelter from the storm," she said, though her tone suggested she was granting them a favor rather than asking for one. "I can pay for hearth space and whatever food you might spare." From his corner, Bjorn watched this exchange with the detached interest of a man who had seen enough of the world to recognize when something was not quite as it appeared. There was nothing wrong with the woman's request, nothing unusual in her manner that he could name, yet something about her presence set his old instincts humming like a drawn bowstring. Perhaps it was the way she carried herself, with the unconscious confidence of someone who had never doubted their place in the world. Perhaps it was the quality of her equipment, too fine for a simple wanderer, too well maintained for someone who had been long on the road. Or perhaps it was simply that in a land where winter drove most sensible folk to seek shelter with kin, here was a woman traveling alone, without apparent fear or urgency. As Svala settled at a table near the fire, Bjorn found himself studying her with the analytical eye that had once served him well in determining friend from foe. Her boots were good leather, well-oiled and sturdy, but showed signs of real travel. Her hands, when she pushed back her hood, were strong and calloused in the way of someone familiar with weapons. A warrior, then, or at least someone who knew. The weight of steel. The other patrons gradually returned to their conversations, though the tenor had changed. There were sideways glances and lowered voices as they speculated about their mysterious guest. Who was she? Where had she come from? What business could possibly drive a woman to brave the winter roads alone? Bjorn heard fragments of their whispered theories. A shieldmaiden seeking a worthy jarl to serve, a merchant's daughter fleeing an unwanted marriage, perhaps even a vulva, a seeress carrying messages between the scattered settlements of the north. Each guess seemed as plausible as the next, and all equally insufficient to explain the magnetic presence that seemed to pull at the very air around her. As the evening wore on, Bjorn noticed that Svala's cup had been empty for some time. Olaf, busy with other customers and perhaps still uncertain how to treat such an unusual guest, had not yet offered to refill it. It was a small thing, an oversight born of confusion rather than discourtesy, but Bjorn had been raised in an older tradition, one that held hospitality as sacred duty. Rising from his corner with the deliberate care of a man whose joints had absorbed too many blows over too many years, Bjorn made his way to where Olaf kept his best ale, not the thin brew served to common travellers, but the rich, honey-touched drink reserved for honoured guests. He filled a clean horn with the amber liquid and crossed the hall to where Svala sat, watching the fire. "The nights are cold and good ale warms more than just the body," he said simply, setting the horn before her. His voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had commanded others, but also the courtesy of one who asked nothing in return. For a moment, their eyes met across the small table, and Bjorn felt something shift in the air between them. Her storm-grey gaze seemed to look through him, to weigh not just his appearance but something deeper, his intentions perhaps, or the measure of his character. It was a feeling he had not experienced in years, this sense of being truly seen by another person. "You have my thanks, warrior," she said, lifting the horn in a gesture that was both gratitude and salute. "It has been too long since anyone showed kindness without expecting payment in return." "No payment needed," Bjorn replied, though he made no move to leave. Something about her voice, perhaps, or the way the firelight played across her features held him in place. "We all need shelter from the storm, one way or another." Svala smiled then, an expression that transformed her stern features into something approaching warmth. Wise words from a man who has clearly weathered many storms himself. Her eyes flicked to his hands, reading the scars and calluses there like runes carved in flesh. "You have the look of someone who has seen much of the world." "Enough," Bjorn said carefully, "though these days I find myself content to let the world pass by without my participation." "Contentment," Svala mused, taking a slow sip of the ale. Her eyes showed appreciation for its quality, a luxury few warriors ever truly achieve. Most of us are too restless, too hungry for the next challenge, the next proof of our worth. There was something in her tone that suggested she spoke from personal experience, and Bjorn found himself curious about what battles this mysterious woman had fought, what victories she had won, what defeats had shaped her understanding of a warrior's heart. But he was too much a gentleman to pry, and too much a tactician to reveal his own interest so openly. Instead, he inclined his head slightly. "May your rest be peaceful then, and may the storm pass quickly." He was turning to go when her voice stopped him. "Stay, if you would. The fire is warm, and I find I have little taste for solitude tonight." Something in her tone, not quite command, not quite request, made Bjorn pause. In all his years of reading men's intentions in the moment before battle, he had rarely encountered such intriguing complexity in a simple invitation. There were layers beneath her words, currents of meaning that his instincts told him were significant, though he could not yet fathom in what way. So he stayed, settling into the chair across from her with the careful movements of a man who had learned to husband his strength. The fire crackled between them, painting their faces in warm gold and deep shadow, while outside the wind continued its ancient song of ice and endurance. Neither spoke immediately, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that exists between people who understand that words should carry weight, that conversation is an art best not rushed. Bjorn sipped his ale and studied his unexpected companion, while Svala gazed into the flames as if they might hold answers to questions she had not yet voiced. In the days to come, he would look back on this moment as the turning point, the instant when his carefully ordered life of quiet retirement began, its transformation into something far more complicated and infinitely more meaningful. But for now, he was content to sit in the warmth and wonder what storms had driven this fascinating stranger to his door, and what storms her presence might herald in return. The ancient mead horn sat between them on the scarred wooden table, its simple presence a bridge between their worlds, his rooted in tradition and fading glory, hers carrying secrets that would soon change everything he thought he knew about fate, fortune, and the courage required to embrace a second chance at greatness. 3 days had passed since the mysterious Svala had arrived in their village, and already the rhythm of life had subtly shifted around her presence. She had taken lodgings in the small room above the baker's shop, paying with silver coins that bore markings none of the villagers recognized but all respected. During the daylight hours, she moved through the settlement with purposeful grace, observing their customs, speaking with the elders, and somehow managing to make herself both visible and enigmatic. At the same time, Bjorn found himself looking forward to the evening hours when she would appear in Olaf's mead-hall, always taking the same table near the fire, always ordering the same simple meal of bread, cheese, and whatever meat was available. Their conversations had grown longer each night, ranging from the practical matters of surviving northern winters to more philosophical discussions about honor, duty, and the paths that led men to their destinies. On this particular evening, the hall was fuller than usual. Word had spread to the outlying farms that a stranger was among them, a woman warrior, some said, others whispered of noble blood or mystical powers, and curiosity had drawn more souls than typically braved the winter cold for an evening's Drinking. The air was thick with smoke, conversation, and the inevitable speculation that surrounded any break in their routine. Bjorn had claimed his usual corner, but tonight he found his attention divided between his ale and the animated discussion. At Svala's table, Eric the blacksmith had challenged her to an arm wrestling match, insisting that no woman, regardless of her reputation, could match the strength built by years at the forge. The crowd had gathered to watch this contest between local champion and mysterious newcomer. What followed surprised everyone except perhaps Svala herself. The match was brief, decisive, and conducted with good humor on both sides. When Eric's massive hand hit the wooden table with a solid thunk, the hall erupted in appreciative laughter and calls for drinks all around. Eric himself seemed more pleased than disappointed, declaring that he had never been beaten so gracefully in his life. It was as Svala rose to accept the congratulations of her impromptu audience that the incident occurred. In the press of bodies around her table, someone jostled her elbow, and the silver arm ring she wore slipped from her wrist to clatter against the stone floor. The sound, sharp as a blade on whetstone, cut through the celebratory noise and brought a sudden, inexplicable hush to the proceedings. Bjorn was closest to where the ring had fallen, and his battle-trained reflexes had him moving before conscious thought could intervene. He bent to retrieve the errant jewelry, intending nothing more than a simple act of courtesy, but as his fingers closed around the silver band, his eyes caught sight of the design worked into its surface, and his breath caught in his throat. The craftsmanship was exquisite, far beyond anything that could be produced in their small village or even in the larger towns of the region. But it was not the artistry that made Bjorn's pulse quicken. It was the symbol etched into the precious metal with perfect precision. A raven in flight, its wings spread wide, clutching a crown in its talons. Below it, carved in runes, so small they could barely be read, was a name that every warrior of the North knew, even if most had never seen it written: Thornblood. The implications hit Bjorn like a physical blow. The House of Thornblood was legend made flesh, a dynasty that had ruled the northern fjords for generations beyond memory. Their wealth was spoken of in whispers, ships beyond counting, lands that stretched from mountain to sea, trading connections that reached to the very edges of the known world. Jarl Magnus Thornblood was said to be the richest man in all the northern kingdoms, and his power was matched only by his reputation for fair dealing and protection of his people. But what made Bjorn's hands tremble as he held the arm ring was not just recognition of the symbol, but understanding of what it meant. This was no mere decoration or purchased trinket. The personal seal of House Thornblood was worn only by blood relatives, and even then, only by those in direct line of succession. If Svala possessed such a ring, wore it as casually as any woman might wear a simple band of silver, then she was no wandering shieldmaiden seeking her fortune. She was nobility of the highest order, possibly even the Jarl's own daughter. Across the suddenly silent hall, their eyes met. Bjorn saw in Svala's storm-grey gaze a complex mixture of emotions: surprise at the ring's loss, resignation at its discovery, and something that might have been relief. For a long moment, neither spoke, and the assembled villagers seemed to hold their collective breath, sensing that something significant had just occurred without fully understanding what it was. Old Gunnar, the village's most senior elder, who broke the silence. The ancient man had been sitting quietly in his corner, as was his custom, but now he leaned forward in his chair, his rheumy eyes fixed on the silver band in Bjorn's hand. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years and the authority of one who had seen much of the world in his long life. That mark, Gunnar said slowly, each word carefully measured. I have seen it once before, long ago when I was young and foolish enough to think I might make my fortune in the courts of great jarls. His gaze shifted from the ring to Svala's face, and something like wonder crept into his expression. The raven and crown of House Thornblood, There are perhaps a dozen people in all the world entitled to wear such a thing." The silence that followed his words was deafening. Every person in the hall understood the implications, even if they could not fully grasp the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Here, in their modest mead-hall, sat someone whose casual jewelry was worth more than their entire village, whose family name carried weight in royal courts they could barely imagine. Bjorn rose slowly, the arm ring cradled in his palm like something that might burn him. He approached Svala's table with the careful steps of a man walking across thin ice, aware that each movement might trigger some catastrophic change in the landscape of his understanding. When he reached her, he extended his hand, offering the returned jewelry without words. Svala accepted the ring with a slight nod of thanks, but made no immediate move to replace it on her wrist. Instead, she held it up to catch the firelight, letting the precious metal gleam, as if she were seeing it for the first time in years. "Beautiful work, is it not?" she said finally, her voice carrying none of the tension that filled the air around them. "My father's craftsmen are skilled beyond measure. They can capture the essence of power in something as simple as a band of silver." "Your father," Bjorn repeated, the words feeling strange in his mouth. He had suspected, but hearing it, confirmed, was somehow different, more real and more devastating to his sense of equilibrium. "Jarl Magnus Thornblood," Svala said simply, as if announcing that the sky was blue or that winter was cold. "Though I suspect you had already guessed as much from the ring's design." The admission rippled through the hall like a stone thrown into still water. Conversations resumed, but in hushed tones, as the villagers struggled to reconcile the woman they had come to know with the revelation of her true identity. Some stared openly, others found sudden interest in their drinks, and more than a few seemed to be calculating whether they should bow, flee, or perhaps both. But Bjorn found himself studying Svala's face, searching for some sign of the deception he felt he should have detected. Instead, what he saw was a woman who looked suddenly tired, as if the weight of carrying her secret had been more burdensome than he had imagined. Her shoulders, usually held with military precision, had sagged slightly, and her eyes held a vulnerability he had not noticed before. "Why?" he asked, the question encompassing everything. Why the disguise? Why their village? Why had she allowed herself to become known to people who could never move in her world? Svala slipped the ring back onto her wrist, but kept her eyes on Bjorn's face as she did so. Because sometimes a woman grows weary of being seen only for what she represents, rather than who she is. Because wealth and power, for all their advantages, can be the loneliest prisons ever devised. She paused, and when she continued, her voice was so soft that only Bjorn could hear. "Because I needed to know if there were still men in this world who would offer kindness to a stranger without first calculating what they might gain in return." The words hit Bjorn with unexpected force. His simple act of hospitality, offering ale to a woman seeking shelter, had been a test he had not known he was taking. More disturbing still was the realization that he had passed, that his instinctive courtesy had somehow marked him as noteworthy in the eyes of someone whose approval could reshape kingdoms. "And what will you do now that your secret is known?" Bjorn asked. Though part of him dreaded the answer, Svala rose from her chair with fluid grace, her bearing once again that of someone born to command. But when she looked at him, her expression held something that might have been regret. "Now I must decide whether the man who would share his ale with a nameless wanderer could ever truly accept the woman who will one day inherit the greatest fortune in the northern lands." She gathered her cloak around her shoulders and moved toward the door, pausing only to add, "And you, Bjorn Ironshield, must decide whether your generous heart is large enough to encompass a truth that changes everything you thought you knew." "About me?" With that she was gone, leaving Bjorn alone with his thoughts and a hall full of villagers who suddenly saw him as either the luckiest or most doomed man in their small world. The silver arm ring had changed everything, transforming A simple act of kindness into something far more complex and dangerous, a bridge between worlds that should never have touched. And the first step on a path that would lead him far from the quiet retirement he had thought he wanted. The morning after the revelation brought no clarity, only the crisp bite of winter air and the weight of questions that had kept Bjorn awake through the long, dark hours. He stood at his window, watching the smoke rise from chimneys across the village, each tendril a reminder that life continued its steady rhythm, despite the upheaval in his own understanding of the world. Svala had not appeared for the morning meal at Olaf's hall, nor had anyone seen her venture from her lodgings above the baker's shop. The village buzzed with whispered speculation. Some claimed she had departed before dawn, others insisted they had seen candlelight in her window well past midnight. But Bjorn knew she remained, if only because leaving would have been the simpler choice. And nothing about this woman suggested she favored simplicity. It was past midday when she finally emerged, and Bjorn watched from his doorway as she made her way not toward the hall or the market, but toward the small grove of ancient oaks that marked the village's eastern boundary. Something in her bearing, purposeful yet unhurried, suggested an invitation rather than an escape. After a moment's hesitation, he pulled on his heavy cloak and followed. He found her seated on a fallen log beneath the largest of the oaks, a massive tree whose gnarled branches had weathered countless storms. Between her hands, she held what appeared to be a wooden box, its surface carved with intricate patterns that spoke of patient craftsmanship. As Bjorn approached, she looked up with an expression that managed to be both welcoming and guarded. "I wondered if you would come," she said simply, making room on the log beside her. Bjorn settled carefully, leaving space between them that acknowledged the changed nature of their relationship without suggesting rejection. "I find myself curious about many things," he admitted, "not least of which is why the daughter of the most powerful Jarl in the northern lands chooses to sit in a grove of trees rather than commanding from a throne." Svala's laugh was soft but genuine, perhaps because thrones are uncomfortable things, and the view from them is often distorted by distance and ceremony. She gestured toward the wooden box in her lap. "I thought you might appreciate this. It belonged to my grandfather, not the Jarl, but my mother's father, a man who made his living carving chess sets for merchants and minor nobles." The box opened to reveal a chess set unlike any Bjorn had ever seen. The pieces were carved from different woods, light birch for one army, dark walnut for the other, and each figure was rendered with such detail and personality that they seemed almost alive. The kings bore the weathered faces of true rulers. The queens radiated both beauty and authority, and even the pawns carried themselves with the dignity of common folk who understood their worth. "He taught me to play when I was barely old enough, to hold the pieces without dropping them," Svala continued, beginning to arrange the board between them on the smooth surface of the log. He said that chess was the perfect teacher for someone who would one day hold power over others. Every piece has value, every move has consequences, and the wise player learns to think not just of the immediate advantage, but of how each decision shapes the battles yet to come. Bjorn studied the board, recognizing the wisdom in her grandfather's teaching. "A merchant's philosophy applied to the game of kings," he mused. "I suspect your father's court would find such thinking uncomfortably practical." "My father's court finds many of my ideas uncomfortable," Svala replied, making the opening move by advancing a pawn 2 spaces. "They prefer their heiress to be decorative rather than strategic, beautiful rather than thoughtful. It makes them nervous when I demonstrate that I understand the difference between the power they show me and the power they actually wield." Bjorn responded with his own pawn move, but his attention was more focused on the woman across from him than on the game itself. "Is that why you travel in disguise? To escape their expectations?" "Partly," she admitted, capturing his pawn with a knight. in a move that was both elegant and ruthless, but also to learn things that cannot be taught in throne rooms or council chambers. My grandfather used to say that a ruler who has never lived among common folk is like a sailor who has never felt the spray of the ocean. They may understand the theory of their craft, but they will never master its reality. The game progressed. Slowly, each move accompanied by conversation that revealed as much about the players as their strategy did. Bjorn found himself impressed not just by Svala's skill at chess, but by the thoughtfulness she brought to each decision. She was clearly several moves ahead in her planning, yet she took time to explain her reasoning when he asked, treating their match as a collaborative exploration rather than a contest to be won. "You play like a general," he observed after she executed a particularly clever combination that left his king in check. "And you play like a man who has commanded others in more serious games than this," she replied, watching as he extracted his king from immediate danger with a move that simultaneously threatened her queen. "There is patience in your strategy, and an understanding that sometimes the strongest piece must retreat in order to advance." As the afternoon shadows lengthened around them, Bjorn began to understand that this chess game was itself a form of communication. Through their moves and counter-moves, Svala was revealing aspects of her character that mere conversation might never have uncovered. She was aggressive when opportunity presented itself, but never reckless. She protected her valuable pieces while using her pawns efficiently. Most telling of all, she seemed to genuinely enjoy the challenge of facing a skilled opponent, even when it meant risking defeat. "Tell me something," Bjorn said as he studied the board, looking for a way to counter her latest gambit. "If you could choose any life for yourself, not as the Jarl's daughter, not bound by the expectations of others, what would it be?" Svala was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming softly against the edge of the wooden box. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a wistfulness that he had not heard before. "I think I would choose to be a teacher," she said. "Not of warfare or statecraft or the management of wealth, but of simpler things. How to read the weather in the flight of birds, how to find peace in solitude, how to recognize honor in unexpected places." She looked up from the board to meet his eyes. "What about you? If you could begin again, knowing what you know now, what path would you choose?" The question caught Bjorn off guard, perhaps because he had not allowed himself to consider such possibilities in years. His life had been shaped by duty and circumstance, by the needs of others and the demands of survival. The luxury of choice had seemed like something for younger men with fewer scars and greater faith in their own futures. "I think," he said slowly, moving his queen to support a defensive position, "I would choose to build something rather than simply protect it. A home, perhaps, or a community where people felt safe enough to be generous with one another. A place where kindness was not seen as weakness and where wisdom was valued more highly than wealth." Svala smiled then, an expression of such warmth that it transformed her entire face. "That sounds like a worthy ambition for any man, perhaps even one that might be achieved by someone who has learned to see beyond the immediate battle to the larger war." Their game continued as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, each move now carrying the weight of deeper understanding. In the careful dance of wooden pieces across the carved board, Bjorn began to glimpse the woman behind the title, the person who had chosen to sit in a village grove and share her grandfather's gift with a stranger who had shown her kindness without knowing her worth. And in that growing twilight, surrounded by ancient trees and the quiet wisdom of a game that had outlasted kingdoms, he began to suspect that the most dangerous move he could make would be the one that led him to fall in love with someone whose world was so far removed from his own that bridging the distance might require more courage than any battle he had ever fought. The discovery came 3 days later, when Bjorn was helping Svala retrieve supplies from her travel pack. The leather satchel had torn during a morning walk through the forest, spilling its contents across the frost-covered ground near the old stone bridge that marked the village's southern approach. What should have been a simple matter of gathering. Scattered belongings became something far more significant when an oiled cloth bundle fell open to reveal its carefully protected contents. Bjorn, quote, S-breath caught as he recognized the object for what it was. A rune-stone map carved from dark slate and inscribed with symbols that traced the coastlines and fjords of the Northern Territories. But this was no ordinary traveler's guide. The detail was extraordinary, showing not just geographical features but the boundaries of territories, the locations of major settlements, and most remarkably, the extent of various jarls' holdings. Marked in different colored stones, inlaid into the slate surface. One territory dominated the map, stretching from the ice-locked northern reaches to the rich trading ports of the southern coast. The boundary stones were silver, and they encompassed lands so vast that Bjorn had to study the scale twice to believe what he was seeing. Mountains, forests, coastal plains, and island chains, all marked with the same silver indicators that proclaimed them part of a single, unified domain. This territory, he said carefully, tracing the silver boundary with his finger. It covers more land than some kingdoms. Svala knelt beside him in the snow, her expression unreadable as she watched him examine the map. My grandfather's grandfather began acquiring those holdings 4 generations ago. Each jarl since has added to them through conquest, marriage, trade agreements, and occasionally simple purchase. We are not merely wealthy, Bjorn. We control the flow of goods from the northern ice fields to the southern markets, the passage of ships through 3 major fjord systems, and the loyalty of more sworn men than most kings can claim. The implications of what she was showing him settled over Bjorn like a heavy cloak. This was not just wealth in the abstract sense of gold and silver, but power in its most practical form, control over resources, trade routes, and the lives of thousands of people. The woman sitting beside him in the snow was not merely nobility, but the heir to what amounted to a northern empire. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked, though part of him feared the answer. "Because I need you to understand what it means," Svala replied simply. "Not the wealth, not the power, but the responsibility. Every silver mark on this map represents people who depend on House Thornblood for their prosperity, their security, their futures. When my father dies, and the healers say it will be soon, all of this becomes mine to manage, to protect, to pass on to the next generation." She began carefully rolling the map, her movements precise despite the obvious emotional weight of her words. "But there is a complication. Our laws require that succession pass through bloodline, and I have no children. If I die without an heir, the holdings will be divided among distant cousins, and centuries of careful building will be torn apart in a generation of feuding and mismanagement." Bjorn felt the pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. "So you travel in search of a husband worthy of sharing such a burden," Svala finished. "Not a man who seeks wealth or power for its own sake, but one who understands what it means to be responsible for something larger than himself. Someone who has proven his character not through grand gestures or noble birth, but through the daily choices that reveal a person's true nature." The weight of her revelations settled between them like a physical thing. Bjorn found himself studying her face, searching for some sign of calculation or manipulation. But what he saw instead was a woman carrying a burden she had not chosen, trying to fulfill obligations she could not escape. The fierce independence he had admired in her took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of necessity rather than preference. "And you believe you might have found such a man?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I believe I may have found a man who offers ale to strangers without counting the cost, who plays chess for the joy of the game rather than the satisfaction of winning, and who asks thoughtful questions rather than making assumptions about what He does not understand. Svala secured the map in its oiled wrapping and returned it to her pack. Whether such a man could accept the transformation that marriage to me would require, that is a question I cannot answer alone. They walked back toward the village in contemplative silence, their footsteps crunching in the snow as each wrestled with the implications of what had been revealed. For Bjorn, the knowledge that Svala's presence in their village was not chance but choice, that she had come seeking specifically the kind of man he might be, was both humbling and terrifying. It suggested that his simple acts of courtesy had been observed, evaluated, and found worthy of consideration for stakes higher than he had ever imagined. But it also raised questions that gnawed at him as they approached the familiar smoke and warmth of home. Could he truly be the partner such a woman needed? His own experience of leadership had been in the clear-cut world of warfare, where enemies were obvious and objectives straightforward. The subtle complexities of managing trade, diplomacy, and the welfare of thousands of people across vast territories seemed as foreign to him as the languages of distant lands. More troubling still was the question of transformation she had mentioned. To marry Svala would mean leaving behind not just his quiet retirement, but his entire identity as it had been forged over decades of experience. He would become not Bjorn the warrior, but Bjorn the co-ruler, the heir by marriage to responsibilities that would reshape every aspect of his existence. That evening, as they sat by the fire in Olaf's hall, their customary table now feeling like an island of familiar comfort in a sea of changed circumstances, Svala produced a small leather pouch from which she withdrew a handful of carved bone pieces. They were gaming pieces, he realized, but unlike any he had seen before. Each was inscribed with runes and shaped to represent different aspects of Norse life. Warriors, farmers, craftsmen, traders, and rulers. Another gift from my grandfather, she explained, beginning to arrange them on the table. He called it the game of lives. Players must build a community, balancing the needs of different groups while managing resources and responding to challenges drawn from a deck of fate cards. He said it taught him more about leadership than all. His formal education combined. As she explained the rules, Bjorn found himself drawn once again into the world of strategic thinking that seemed to be second nature to her. But this time, the game felt less like entertainment and more like preparation, a chance to explore in miniature and with limited consequences the kind of decisions that would define their real lives if he chose to accept the path she was offering. The evening passed in intense concentration, their game punctuated by discussions of philosophy, ethics, and the practical challenges of governing justly. With each turn, each difficult decision about resource allocation or response to crisis, Bjorn gained deeper appreciation for the complexity of the role Svala would soon inherit. But he also began to glimpse how his own experience, his understanding of human nature forged in the crucible of combat, his instinct for reading truth beneath surface appearances, might complement her more formal education in statecraft. As the fire burned low and other patrons departed for their homes, they sat surrounded by the small carved figures that represented lives and livelihoods, both of them understanding that the real game they were playing had stakes far beyond the reach of bone and runes. The runestone map had revealed the scope of what lay before them, but it was in the quiet intimacy of shared strategy and mutual respect that Bjorn began to believe he might be strong enough to shoulder such a destiny, if he could find the courage to reach for it. The raven arrived on a morning when the wind carried the sharp promise of fresh snow. Bjorn was splitting wood behind his dwelling when he heard the distinctive cry overhead, not the harsh caw of common crows, but the deeper, more resonant call of a true raven. When he looked up, he saw the great black bird circling once before, landing on the post of his gate, a small leather cylinder bound to its leg with silk cord. Ravens were not uncommon in these northern lands, but this one bore the unmistakable marks of training. Its behavior too purposeful, its arrival too coincidental with Svala's presence in the village. As Bjorn approached cautiously, the bird regarded him with intelligent dark eyes, showing none of the skittishness of wild creatures. It remained perfectly still as he carefully untied the message cylinder, then launched itself skyward with powerful wing beats that carried it back toward the northern horizon. The cylinder was sealed with wax that bore the same raven and crown symbol Bjorn had seen on Svala's arm ring. Inside, he found a small scroll written in the formal script used for official communications, though the words themselves were personal and urgent. "My beloved daughter," it began, "the healers grow more grave in their pronouncements with each passing day. The fever that has plagued me these past weeks shows no sign of breaking, and I fear my time grows short. I have done what I can to prepare the succession, but there are matters that cannot wait for your return. The council grows restless, and there are whispers among the minor jarls about the wisdom of leaving such vast holdings in the hands of an unmarried woman. You must make your choice soon, child, for the sake of all who depend on our house. If you have found the man you seek, bring him with all speed. If not, return alone, and we will arrange the political alliance that duty demands, even if it brings neither of us joy. Your loving father, Magnus Thornblood." Bjorn read the message twice, each word sinking into his understanding like stones, into still water. Here was confirmation of what Svala had only hinted at, that time was running out, that her search for a worthy partner was not a luxury she could afford to extend indefinitely. More disturbing still was the reference to political alliances, suggesting that if she failed to find someone she could choose freely, others would make the choice for her based on strategic considerations rather than personal compatibility. He found Svala by the old stone bridge, where they had shared so many conversations over the past weeks. She sat on the low wall, her gaze fixed on the ice-covered stream below, and something in her posture told him that she too had received word from the north. When she looked up at his approach, her storm-grey eyes held a weariness that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. "You have heard from your father," he said, settling beside her on the cold stone. "Word came with the dawn," she confirmed, producing her own message cylinder from within her cloak. "The same raven, I suspect, trained to find me wherever I might be. My father always said that good intelligence was the foundation of wise rulership." They sat in silence for a moment, both understanding that the leisurely pace of their developing relationship had just been overtaken by the urgency of external circumstances. The luxury of time, to learn each other's hearts, to build trust gradually, to let affection grow naturally, had been stripped away by the demands of succession and politics. "How long do we have?" Bjorn asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. "Days, perhaps weeks if fortune smiles upon us, but no longer." Svala's voice carried the weight of resignation mixed with determination. "The Council of Jarls meets at the winter solstice to confirm the succession. If I appear before them unmarried, they will invoke the ancient laws that allow them to arrange a political match in the interest of stability. I will become a playing piece in their strategic games, rather than the ruler they are supposed to serve." Bjorn found himself thinking of the runestone map, of the vast territories that would be affected by such maneuvering, of the thousands of people whose lives would be shaped by decisions made in council chambers, far from their daily concerns. The abstract became suddenly viscerally real. This was not just about Svala's personal happiness, but about the kind of leadership an entire region would receive for generations to come. "Who would they choose for you?" he asked, curious, despite himself, about what kind of man political considerations would produce. "Ragnar Blackmane, most likely," Svala replied with obvious distaste. "Young, ambitious, well-connected through his mother's line to 3 other major houses. He has wealth of his own, military experience, and most importantly from the council's perspective, no ideas about sharing power with his wife. I would become a broodmare with a crown, valued for my bloodline and my ability to produce heirs. but expected to leave all actual decisions to my husband and his advisors. The bitterness in her voice revealed how thoroughly she understood what such an arrangement would mean for her, and by extension, for the territories under her rule. A man who had no respect for his wife's capabilities was unlikely to show much more consideration for the needs of common folk, particularly if his primary qualification was political convenience rather than genuine competence. "And if you were to choose freely?" Bjorn asked. Though he suspected he already knew the answer, Svala turned to face him fully, her expression serious, but not without warmth. "If I were to choose freely, I would choose a man who has proven his character through adversity, who understands leadership as service rather than privilege, and who would value partnership over domination." She paused, reaching out to place her hand over his on the stone wall between them. "I would choose a man who offers ale to strangers, who plays games for the joy of learning rather than the satisfaction of winning, and who asks thoughtful questions about matters that will affect people he has never met." The weight of her words, of the choice she was offering him, settled over Bjorn like a mantle he was not certain he was strong enough to bear. Everything in his careful, quiet retirement would have to be abandoned. Everything he thought he knew about his remaining years would have to be reconsidered. But as he looked into Svala's eyes, seeing there not just affection, but genuine respect for his judgment, he began to understand that this was not just about accepting her offer, it was about deciding what kind of man he truly was, and what kind of legacy he wanted to leave behind. The dying message from Jarl Magnus Thornblood had changed everything, compressing their timeline and forcing decisions that neither of them felt entirely prepared to make. But it had also clarified the stakes in a way that mere conversation never could. This was no longer about two people slowly discovering whether they might build a life together. It was about whether they could build a partnership strong enough to shoulder the responsibility for an empire, and whether they could do it in the brief time remaining before others made the choice for them. As snow began to fall around them, dusting the stone bridge and the frozen stream below with pristine white, both of them understood that their next words would determine not just their own futures, but the fate of everyone whose lives would be touched by the power they might wield together. That evening, by the warmth of his own hearth, Bjorn made a decision that surprised even himself. He rose from his chair and moved to the wooden chest that held his most precious possessions, items he had not disturbed in the 5 years since hanging up his warrior's gear. His hands, steady despite the magnitude of what he was contemplating, lifted out a sword wrapped in oiled leather. The weapon was not grand by the standards of royal armories. Its blade bore no jeweled pommel, no intricate engravings that proclaimed the wealth or status of its owner. But as Bjorn unwrapped it carefully, revealing steel that gleamed despite its age, he knew that Svala would understand its true worth. This had been his father's sword, and his grandfather's before that, a weapon earned through service rather than inherited through privilege, carried by men who had fought for principles rather than profit. The craftsmanship was exceptional in its simplicity. The blade had been forged by someone who understood that a warrior's life might depend on the balance of weight and strength, on steel that would hold its edge through the chaos of battle and the long years of peace that followed. The leather grip, worn smooth by generations of hands, fit Bjorn's palm as naturally as if it had been made for him alone. When Svala knocked on his door an hour later, their evening conversations had become routine, though tonight felt different. From all the others, she found him seated at his small table with the sword laid before him, like an offering on an altar. Her eyes went immediately to the weapon, and Bjorn saw recognition there, not of this particular blade, but of what it represented. She had been raised among warriors, had learned to read the stories that weapons told about their owners. What she saw here was not a symbol of aggression, but of protection, not conquest, but service. "Tell me about it," she said simply, settling. In the chair across from him, Bjorn, quote's fingers traced the sword's fuller, the groove that ran along the blade's center. My great-grandfather carried it when he served as a huskarl to Jarl Erik the Bold. The old stories say he saved the Jarl's life 3 times in a single battle, using nothing but this blade and the wisdom to know when to strike and when to shield. Others, he paused, remembering the tales his own father had told him on winter nights much like this one. My grandfather bore it through the Great Famine, when he led hunting parties into the deep forests to bring back meat for starving families. He never took more than his share, never used his skill with the sword to claim resources others needed. Svala listened without interruption, understanding that these stories were more than family history. They were the foundation of Bjorn's character, the principles that had shaped every choice he had made in his own life. And your father? She prompted gently. He carried it for 30 years as a shield brother to various jarls, always in service, never in conquest for its own sake. When he could no longer wield it in battle, he became a teacher, showing young men how to fight not just with skill, but with honor. Bjorn's voice carried the warmth of deep respect. He used to say that any fool could learn to kill with a sword, but it took wisdom to know when not to draw it, and courage to protect those who could not protect themselves. The sword lay between them in the lamplight, its plain steel somehow more impressive than any decorated blade might have been. This was a working tool, made beautiful through use, a weapon that had served generations of men who understood the difference between strength and mere violence. "Why are you showing me this now?" Svala asked, though something in her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. Bjorn met her eyes across the small space of his humble dwelling, this woman who could command fleets and armies, but who sat in his simple chair as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Because if I am to be your partner in ruling the northern lands, you should know what kind of man stands beside you. Not a warrior seeking glory, not a noble demanding recognition, but someone whose family has always believed that true strength serves others before itself." He lifted the sword, testing its familiar weight in his hands. Despite the years since, he had last wielded it. The balance felt perfect, the grip secure. But more importantly, holding it reminded him of who he was beneath the quiet retirement he had wrapped around himself like armor against the world's expectations. This blade has never been raised in aggression, never been drawn for personal gain or petty revenge. Every man who carried it understood that its purpose was to protect, to serve, to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. He set the weapon down carefully, his decision crystallizing as he spoke. "If you will have me as your husband and partner, Svala, Thorn's daughter, I will bring to our union not wealth or political connections, but the promise that these principles will guide every choice we make together." The silence that followed was profound, filled with the weight of commitment and the magnitude of what they were choosing. Svala reached across the table, her fingers tracing the sword's simple crossguard, feeling the history embedded in its worn steel. "In my father's treasure rooms," she said finally, "there are weapons worth fortunes, blades forged by master smiths, hilts set with gems that could purchase entire villages, swords that have been passed down through royal lineages for centuries." She looked up from the weapon to meet his eyes. "But I have never seen one that carried such clear evidence of the honor of those who wielded it. This sword tells me more about your worthiness to rule beside me than any declaration of noble birth or catalogue of military victories ever could." She rose from her chair and moved to stand beside him, her hand coming to rest on his shoulder with gentle pressure. "If we do this, Bjorn, if we join our lives and accept the burden of leadership together, it will change everything about how we live. There will be no more quiet evenings by simple hearths, no more freedom to choose our daily concerns. Every decision we make will affect thousands of lives. Every choice will be scrutinized by those who seek to find fault or opportunity in our actions." Bjorn stood as well, the sword still in his hands, its weight somehow lighter now that he had committed to the path before them. Then we will make those decisions together, guided by principles that put the welfare of our people above our own comfort. We will bear that scrutiny knowing that our intentions are honest and our commitment is real. In the warm lamplight of his modest dwelling, surrounded by the simple possessions of a life lived without pretense, they sealed their commitment not with grand gestures or formal ceremonies, but with the quiet understanding that sometimes the most profound choices are made in the most ordinary circumstances. The father's sword lay between them, like a bridge connecting their different worlds, his rooted in service and tradition, hers reaching toward power and responsibility, but united now by shared values and mutual respect. Outside comma. The wind continued its winter song, but neither of them heard it. They were too busy planning for a future that would demand everything they had to give, and finding in that prospect not fear, but the kind of purpose that comes when two people discover they are stronger together than either could ever be alone. The royal summons arrived, not with the subtle discretion of a trained raven, but with the thunderous approach of armed riders, whose breath steamed in the bitter morning air like dragon's smoke. Bjorn was awakened by the sound of hoofbeats on frozen ground, and the jangle of mail and weapons that spoke of men accustomed to being obeyed without question. Through his window he could see a column of horsemen in the colors of House Thornblood, their banners snapping in the wind like angry birds seeking prey. At their head rode a man whose bearing proclaimed his authority even more clearly than the golden torque at his throat or the richly decorated sword at his side. This was Harold Ironhand, the Jarl's personal champion and captain of his household guard, a warrior whose reputation extended throughout the northern lands as a man who had never failed in any mission his lord had set before him. The villagers emerged from their homes like startled rabbits, gathering in small clusters to witness this unprecedented invasion of their quiet world. Some whispered prayers to the old gods, others simply stared in fascination at the display of wealth and power that had materialized in their midst like something from the ancient sagas. Children peeked around their mothers' skirts while their fathers gripped whatever tools were nearest, though everyone understood that simple farming implements would be useless against professional warriors. Harold, S voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of one who had delivered royal commands, across battlefields and throne rooms alike. The scroll he held bore the full seal of House Thornblood, pressed into red wax that gleamed like blood in the pale winter sunlight. By order of Magnus Thornblood, Jarl of the Northern Fjords, Keeper of the Silver Locks, Lord of the Ice Roads, Harold declared, his words carrying across the village square with formal precision. His daughter, Svala Thornsdaughter, is commanded to return immediately to attend upon her dying father and fulfill her duties to the succession. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the stamping of horses and the creak of leather as the warriors shifted in their saddles. Every eye in the village turned toward the small building above the baker's shop where their mysterious guest had lodged, waiting to see how she would respond to this public revelation of her identity. When Svala emerged, she had transformed herself. From the simple traveler they had known into someone who could never be mistaken for anything other than what she truly was, nobility of the highest order. Her traveling clothes had been replaced by a dress of deep blue wool trimmed with silver thread, her copper hair bound up in the elaborate style favored by court ladies, her bearing radiating the unconscious authority of someone born to command. But it was the expression on her face that told the true story of this moment. Here was a woman who had been enjoying the freedom to choose her own path, suddenly confronted with the unyielding demands of duty and bloodline. The transformation was not just in her appearance, but in her entire presence. The relaxed openness that had characterized her time in the village was gone, replaced by the careful composure required of someone who could never afford to show weakness before others. Harold Ironhand, she acknowledged, her voice carrying both recognition and resignation. I assume my father's condition has worsened if he sends his champion rather than trusting to ravens and messengers. Your father clings to life by force of will alone, my lady, Harold replied, though his tone softened slightly when addressing her directly. The healers say he has perhaps days remaining, and the council grows restless. There are those who question whether the succession can be delayed much longer, regardless of your personal wishes in the matter of marriage. Bjorn felt the words hit him like physical blows. He had known this moment would come, but the sudden reality of it, the transformation of Svala from his intimate companion to a figure of distant authority, the reminder of forces beyond their control that would shape their fate, left him feeling as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. The royal summons was more than just a call to return home. It was a declaration that their time of freedom, of quiet conversation and growing affection, was over. From this moment forward, every word would be measured, every action scrutinized, every choice made, with the weight of political consequence pressing down upon them. But it was Harold's next words that truly shattered the world they had been building together. There is more, my lady. Ragnar Blackmane has formally petitioned the council for your hand in marriage, citing the urgent need for stability and the ancient laws that require the succession to pass through married bloodlines. The council has agreed to consider his proposal favorably if you do not return with a chosen husband within 7 days of this summons. The threat was clear, and it recontextualized everything that had passed between Bjorn and Svala. What he had thought was a gradual courtship, a careful exploration of compatibility and affection, had actually been conducted under the pressure of an approaching deadline that would strip away her freedom to choose entirely. Svala, quote, composure held, but Bjorn could see the tension in the set of her shoulders, the slight tightening around her eyes that spoke of anger carefully controlled. She had been managing this crisis all along, balancing her personal desires against political necessity, and now the balance had shifted decisively toward duty and obligation. "And what does my father say to this petition?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer would bring no comfort. "Your father wishes above all for your happiness, but he is weakening rapidly, and his influence over the council diminishes with each passing day. He has instructed me to tell you that he will support whatever choice you make, but that choice must be made swiftly and decisively." Harold's eyes flicked briefly toward Bjorn, who had emerged from his dwelling to stand with the other villagers. Witnessing this drama, he also instructed me to evaluate any potential husband you might present to ensure that he possesses the qualities necessary for sharing the burden of rule. The implication was clear. Bjorn would be judged, tested, measured against standards he could barely imagine, let alone meet. His simple life, his humble origins, his lack of political connections or formal education in statecraft would all be weighed against the demands of ruling territories that stretched beyond the horizon. But even as doubt crept through his mind, like winter cold seeping through inadequate clothing, Bjorn found himself thinking of his father's sword, of the principles it represented, of the generations of men who had carried it not in pursuit of personal glory, but in service to others. Perhaps formal education in ruling was less important than understanding the difference between leadership and mere authority. Perhaps the qualities that made a good ruler were not so different from those that made a good man. Svala seemed to reach the same conclusion, for when she spoke again, her voice carried the decisive clarity of someone who had weighed all options and chosen her path. "Captain Harold, I present to you Bjorn Ironshield, shield brother to Jarls, protector of the innocent, and the man I have chosen to stand beside me as co-ruler of our father's lands." Her eyes found Bjorn's across the crowded square, and in them he saw not just affection, but absolute certainty. He may lack the political connections that some might prefer, but he possesses something far more valuable, the wisdom to put the welfare of others before his own ambitions, and the strength of character to bear the weight of responsibility without being corrupted by it. Harold's assessment of Bjorn was swift and professional, the evaluation of a career soldier who had served alongside many different types of men. What he saw was someone whose scars told stories of real battles fought for worthy causes, whose bearing suggested competence without arrogance, whose response to this sudden elevation was thoughtful consideration rather than eager grasping for power. If you have chosen him, my lady, then he will be tested as tradition demands. But we must depart immediately. Every hour we delay increases the risk that political necessity will override personal choice. As the villagers watched in fascination and growing understanding, their quiet neighbor was transformed from retired warrior to future co-ruler of the Northern Territories. The royal summons had not just revealed Svala's true identity, it had forced both of them to step fully into roles that would define not just their own futures, but the fate of everyone, whose lives would be touched by the power they would soon wield together. The time for gradual courtship and careful evaluation was over. Now they would face the ultimate test, whether the bond they had forged in the quiet intimacy of village life was strong enough to withstand the harsh scrutiny of royal courts and the crushing responsibility of ruling an empire. The journey northward to the seat of House Thornblood's power was unlike anything Bjorn had ever experienced. The column of riders moved with military precision through landscapes that grew increasingly grand and imposing with each passing mile. What had begun as familiar northern wilderness gradually transformed into cultivated territories where every field, every grove of trees, every bridge across frozen streams bore the subtle marks of careful management and abundant resources. By the third day, they were traveling roads paved with fitted stones, passing through settlements that were less villages than small towns. Their prosperity evident in the quality of construction, the richness of trade goods displayed in market squares, and the well-fed appearance of livestock grazing in protected pastures. This was wealth not as display, but as infrastructure, the kind of systematic development that required generations of wise investment and careful stewardship. Riding beside Svala at the head of the column, Bjorn began to grasp the true magnitude of what she would inherit. This was not simply land and gold, but an entire civilization built through the accumulated wisdom and effort of countless people over decades of peace and prosperity. The responsibility for maintaining and protecting all of this would soon rest on their shoulders, and the weight of that realization grew heavier with each mile they traveled. "Your grandfather built well," he observed, watching a group of children play in a village square, while their parents conducted business with the easy confidence of people who had never known want or fear. He understood that true wealth comes from the prosperity of those you rule, not from what you can extract from them, Svala replied. But there was tension in her voice that had not been present during their quiet conversations in the village. "The question is whether we will prove worthy of that legacy, or whether it will be squandered by those who see power as an end in itself rather than a means of service." The closer they came to their destination, the more formal their interactions became. Not by choice, Bjorn could see in Svala's eyes the same longing for the simple intimacy they had shared, but by necessity. Harold and his men watched everything with professional attention, and their reports would influence how Bjorn was received at court. Every word, every gesture was now part of the evaluation that would determine whether he would be accepted as worthy of the role fate was offering him. On the fourth evening, as they made camp in a pavilion that was larger and more luxurious than most common dwellings, Harold approached Bjorn with the careful manner of someone delivering information that might be unwelcome but was certainly necessary. "Tomorrow we reach Ironhold, the seat of House Thornblood," the captain said without preamble. "Before we arrive, there are things you should understand about what awaits you there." Bjorn set down the piece of leather he had been repairing. His saddle had suffered damage during the day's hard riding and gave Harold his full attention. Despite the difference in their stations, he had found the captain to be a man of straightforward honesty, someone whose loyalty to Svala and her father was absolute, but not blind to the complexities of their situation. "The Jarl is dying," Harold continued bluntly. "Not just ill, but actively failing in ways that are visible to anyone who sees him. This has created a crisis of confidence among some of the minor Jarls who owe him allegiance. They whisper that perhaps it is time for new leadership, younger blood, fresh approaches to the challenges facing our territories. And they see Ragnar, Blackmane, as providing that leadership?" Bjorn asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Ragnar has been careful to position himself as the inevitable choice should Lady Svala prove unsuitable for rule. He has cultivated alliances, made promises, suggested that a woman, even one as capable as the Jarl's daughter, lacks the strength necessary for the difficult decisions that lie ahead." Harold's expression showed what he thought of such arguments. He has also hinted that her prolonged absence from court, her failure to take a husband from among the established noble families, demonstrates a lack of seriousness about her responsibilities. The political maneuvering was more complex than anything Bjorn had encountered in his military service, where enemies were obvious and objectives clear. This was warfare conducted with words and alliances, where today's supporter might become tomorrow's opponent, based on calculations of advantage that shifted with each new development. "What must I do to prove myself worthy?" Bjorn asked simply. Harold studied him for a long moment, as if weighing how much truth the situation could bear. "You will be tested in 3 traditional ways," he said finally. "First, in single combat against a champion of the council's choosing, not to the death, but to demonstrate your skill and courage. Second, in wisdom, through questions about law, justice, and the proper governance of territories and people. Third, in judgment by your responses to scenarios that test your character and decision-making under pressure." Each test represented a different aspect of leadership, Bjorn realized. Physical courage and competence were necessary for any ruler who might need to defend his territory or lead warriors in battle. Wisdom in law and governance was essential for the day-to-day management of complex territories and diverse populations. But it was the test of judgment that would reveal whether he possessed the moral foundation necessary to wield power responsibly. "And if I fail any of these tests?" he asked. "Then Lady Svala will be strongly encouraged to accept Ragnar's proposal for the good of the realm," Harold replied grimly. "The council has the legal authority to override her personal preferences if they judge her choice to be unsuitable for the responsibilities of joint rule." That night, unable to sleep despite the comfortable bedding provided by their traveling arrangements, Bjorn found himself standing outside the pavilion, gazing up at stars that seemed different here in this land of wealth and power. The simple clarity of his former life felt very far away, replaced by complications and considerations he was still struggling to understand fully. Svala joined him in the darkness, moving with the silent grace that had first marked her as someone extraordinary. In the starlight, wrapped in a cloak against the cold, she looked vulnerable in a way that the formal requirements of their journey had not previously allowed. "Are you having second thoughts?" she asked quietly, standing close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence. "I am thinking about what it means to be worthy of something," Bjorn replied honestly. "In battle, worthiness was straightforward. You protected your shield brothers, you followed orders that served a just cause, you faced death without bringing dishonor to yourself or those who depended on you. But this," he gestured toward the distant lights that marked the approaching boundaries of Ironhold. "This requires kinds of strength I am not certain I possess." Svala was silent for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had wrestled with similar doubts. "Do you know what I see when I look at those lights?" I see thousands of people sleeping peacefully because they trust that someone is watching over their welfare, making decisions that put their needs above personal ambition. I see children who will grow up with opportunities their parents could never have imagined because someone before them chose to build rather than merely consume. She turned to face him directly, her storm-grey eyes reflecting the starlight. The question is not whether you are already perfectly suited for such responsibility. No one is. The question is whether you care enough about those sleeping people to spend the rest of your life learning how to serve them better, even when it costs you everything you thought you wanted for yourself. In her words, Bjorn heard an echo of his father's teachings about the true purpose of strength, of the blade that served others before itself. Perhaps the tests that awaited him were not about proving he already possessed all the necessary qualities, but about demonstrating his commitment to growing into them. As dawn approached on what would be their final day of travel, Bjorn felt something settle into place within him. Not confidence exactly, but a clear understanding of what was at stake and why it mattered. Tomorrow would bring the crown of Thornblood into view, that symbol of authority and responsibility that Svala would soon inherit. Whether he would be worthy to share that burden remained to be seen, but he would face the testing with the same principles that had guided his father's sword through generations of honorable service. The approaching lights of Ironhold grew brighter as the column resumed its northward journey, carrying them toward a destiny that would demand everything they had to give and test whether their bond was strong enough to bear the weight of an empire built on the dreams and trust of countless people who would never know their names, but whose lives would be shaped by every choice they made together. Ironhold rose from the landscape like a vision from the ancient sagas, its massive stone walls and soaring towers speaking of power that had endured for generations. But it was not the fortress itself that took Bjorn's breath away. It was the sight of the great hall's doors standing open despite the bitter cold, and the figure of a dying jarl propped in a chair of carved oak, wrapped in furs yet still radiating. The authority that had made him legend throughout the northern lands, Magnus Thornblood, was a shadow of the warrior king stories had made him, his once powerful frame reduced by illness to something almost fragile. Yet his eyes, the same storm-grey as his daughter's, burned with intelligence and will that death itself seemed reluctant to challenge. When he spoke, his voice carried across the courtyard with the remnants of the power that had once commanded fleets and armies. So, he said, his gaze fixed unwaveringly on Bjorn, this is the man my daughter has chosen to help her carry the burden I can no longer bear. The formal testing began immediately, witnessed by a circle of jarls whose expressions ranged from skeptical to openly hostile. Bjorn could see Ragnar Blackmane among them, a younger man whose confidence bordered on arrogance, whose eyes held the calculating gleam of someone already counting the wealth and power he expected to inherit through marriage to Svala. The first test was combat, and the council's chosen champion was a giant of a man named Thorstein Axebreaker, whose reputation for strength was matched only by his skill with weapons. The fight was conducted with blunted swords in the tradition of honor duels, but everyone understood that while death might not be the goal, serious injury remained a distinct possibility. What followed surprised everyone, including Bjorn himself. His years of retirement had not dulled his instincts or weakened his skills as much as he had feared. More importantly, his style of fighting, defensive, patient, focused on wearing down opponents rather than overwhelming them, proved perfectly suited to facing a stronger but less experienced adversary. When Thorstein finally yielded, breathing heavily and nursing a bruised sword arm, the murmur from the watching jarls carried a note of grudging respect. The second test, wisdom in law and governance, revealed the depth of Bjorn's practical understanding of leadership. While he lacked formal education in the complex legal codes that governed noble houses, his years of service had taught him the fundamental principles that underlay all just rule: fairness, consistency, and the recognition that authority existed. To serve those who were governed rather than to enrich those who governed. When presented with hypothetical disputes between merchants and farmers, between different settlements claiming the same resource rights, between tradition and the needs of changing times, Bjorn's responses showed a mind that instinctively sought solutions benefiting the greatest number while protecting the vulnerable. His answers were not always what the Jarls expected, but they were reasoned, compassionate, and demonstrated an understanding that good governance required more than merely following established precedent. It was the third test, judgment under pressure, that would determine whether he truly possessed the character necessary for joint rule with Svala. The scenario presented was both simple and devastating in its implications. A harsh winter had struck one of the outer provinces, and food supplies were running dangerously low. A merchant ship filled with grain had arrived in port, but the captain was demanding prices so high that only the wealthy could afford to eat, while common folk starved. What action should a just ruler take? Bjorn's response was immediate and unequivocal. Seize the ship's cargo, distribute the grain to those who need it most, and compensate the merchant fairly for his goods at standard market rates. If he refuses this arrangement, inform him that ships attempting to exploit desperate people will not be welcome in our ports in future seasons. The silence that followed his answer was profound. Some of the Jarls looked shocked by such decisive action against established commercial practices. Others nodded approvingly at the demonstration of priorities that put human welfare above merchant profits. But it was the expression on Magnus Thornblood's face that mattered most. Satisfaction mixed with something that might have been relief. And, if other merchants claim this sets a dangerous precedent, pressed one of the council members. If they argue that seizing cargo, regardless of justification, threatens the foundation of trade relationships, then they reveal that their primary concern is profit, rather than the welfare of the people who make their prosperity possible. Bjorn replied calmly. A ruler who will not act decisively to prevent starvation among his people is not worthy of the title, regardless of what merchants or even fellow nobles might prefer. His words hung in the cold air like a challenge thrown down before all assembled. Here was a man who understood that leadership sometimes required difficult choices, that the courage to act righteously was more important than the comfort of maintaining pleasant relationships with those whose interests conflicted with justice. Magnus Thornblood struggled to his feet, supported by Harold but refusing to remain seated for what he clearly intended to be his final act as undisputed Lord of the Northern Territories. In his hands, trembling slightly with illness but steady with purpose, he held the crown of Thornblood, not the ornate ceremonial piece worn for great occasions, but the simple circlet of silver and iron that symbolized the daily burden of responsible leadership. But before he could speak the words that would bind Bjorn's fate to his daughters, Ragnar Blackmane stepped forward, his voice carrying the confident authority of someone who believed the game was not yet over. "I invoke the right of formal challenge," Ragnar declared, his voice cutting through the cold air with practiced authority. "The laws of succession are clear. When the worthiness of a proposed consort is in question, any noble of sufficient rank may demand trial by combat to determine the will of the gods." The gathered Jarls shifted uneasily, some nodding approval, while others looked troubled by this escalation. Magnus Thornblood's grip tightened on the crown, his grey eyes flashing with anger despite his weakened state. "The tests have been completed and passed," the dying Jarl said, each word carefully measured. "By what right do you question the judgment of this council?" Ragnar's smile held no warmth, only the satisfaction of someone playing a game whose rules he had studied carefully. "By the right of one who has served this house faithfully for 7 years, who has bled in its defense, and who offers an alliance that would unite 3 great houses under a single banner." He gestured toward a group of Jarls whose expensive furs and golden arm rings marked them as men of significant wealth and influence. "I speak not for myself alone, but for those who believe the northern territories require leadership born to understand the complexities of noble rule. The political maneuvering was masterful, Bjorn had to admit. Ragnar was not just challenging him personally, but positioning himself as the representative of established order against the dangerous precedent of allowing common birth to reach for noble privilege. The gathered jarls would have to choose not just between two men, but between two philosophies of what qualified someone to wield power over others. And what form would this trial take? Svala asked, her voice cutting through the tension with quiet authority. She had remained silent during the formal testing, but now she stepped forward to stand beside her father, her bearing that of someone who would not be excluded from decisions about her own fate. "Single combat to first blood or yield," Ragnar replied promptly. "The traditional method of allowing the gods to reveal truth when men's wisdom proves insufficient." Bjorn felt the weight of every gaze upon him as he considered this challenge. He had already proven himself in one fight today, but Thorstein Axebreaker had been a test of skill and endurance. Ragnar was younger, fresher, and fighting not just for victory, but for everything he had worked years to achieve. More dangerous still, he was fighting on his home ground before allies who shared his vision of how power should be distributed. But as Bjorn looked at Svala, seeing in her storm-grey eyes not fear, but absolute faith in his character, if not necessarily his sword arm, he understood that this moment was about more than personal combat. This was about whether the northern territories would be ruled by those who saw power as a birthright to be inherited, or by those who understood it as a responsibility to be earned through service to others. "I accept," he said simply, drawing his father's sword from its scabbard. The plain steel gleamed in the afternoon light, unmarked by jewels or decorative engravings, but carrying the weight of generations of honorable service. The circle of witnesses expanded as word spread through. Iron hold that the succession would be decided by combat. Magnus Thornblood was helped to a chair where he could observe the proceedings. The crown of Thornblood still clutched in his trembling hands, like a talisman of the authority that would soon pass to a new generation. What followed was not the brief, decisive encounter that many had expected. Ragnar was indeed skilled, his blade work polished by years of training with the finest swordmasters money could hire. But Bjorn fought with the calm patience of someone who had learned his skills in the crucible of real warfare, where style mattered less than survival and flashy technique was less valuable than simple, effective tactics. The turning point came when Ragnar, growing frustrated by his inability to land a decisive blow, overextended himself in a complex combination that left him momentarily vulnerable. Bjorn's response was neither elegant nor spectacular. A simple thrust that slipped past Ragnar's guard to draw a thin line of blood across his opponent's sword-arm. The silence that followed was absolute. Ragnar stared down at the crimson stains spreading across his sleeve, his expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and finally, a grudging recognition that he had been outmatched by someone he had dismissed as unworthy of serious consideration. Magnus Thornblood rose unsteadily to his feet, his voice carrying across the courtyard with the authority of his final official act. "The gods have spoken. The succession is confirmed." But it was not the crown that sealed their union. It was the appearance of an ancient wooden box that Svala produced from among her belongings. Inside, nestled in silk cloth, lay two rings unlike any Bjorn had ever seen. They appeared to be carved from ice and fire made solid, one gleaming with the cold light of winter stars, the other glowing with the warm radiance of hearth fire. "The wedding rings of ice and fire," Magnus explained, his voice growing weaker but filled with satisfaction. "Carved from the heart of glaciers and the core of forge flames by the first rulers of this house, when the world was younger and such. Magics were possible. They symbolized the balance required for wise rule, the cool judgment of winter, and the warm compassion of summer hearth. As Bjorn and Svala exchanged these ancient symbols of union and shared responsibility, witnessed by nobles who now understood that the old order was giving way to something new, the throne room fell silent, except for the whispered blessings of those who recognized that they were witnessing not just a marriage, but the beginning of a new chapter in the history of the northern lands. 3 seasons had passed since that winter day, when a simple act of kindness changed the course of 2 lives and the fate of the northern territories. Now, as autumn painted the fjords in shades of gold and crimson, Bjorn stood once again in a mead-hall, but this one was grander than any he had ever imagined. The great hall of Ironhold, where jarls and merchants, warriors and craftsmen gathered, not in the rigid hierarchy of traditional courts, but in the more egalitarian atmosphere that he and Svala had worked to establish. The transformation had not been without challenges. Some of the older nobles had struggled to adapt to rulers who insisted on hearing directly from common folk about their concerns, who made decisions based on practical benefit rather than political advantage, who demonstrated that true strength served others before itself. A few had departed for courts where their traditional privileges remained unquestioned, but most had gradually come to appreciate leaders whose policies brought genuine prosperity rather than merely the appearance of wealth. At the high table, where the ancient symbols of House Thornblood were displayed with reverent care, sat a new addition to their collection of treasures. It was neither gold nor silver, jeweled crown nor ancient weapon, but a simple leather scroll case that had arrived that morning with news that would reshape their understanding of what they had accomplished together. Svala lifted the document, with hands that still bore the calluses of weapons training, but now also showed the ink stains of someone who spent long hours drafting legislation and trade agreements. Her pregnancy was beginning to show, a gentle rounding that spoke of the heir their people had hoped for and the continuation of the bloodline that would secure the peace they had worked so hard to build. Word from the southern kingdoms, she announced to the assembled court, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had grown fully into the role of ruler. The trade agreements we negotiated have proven so successful that King Harold requests permission to send ambassadors to study our methods of governance. It seems that our approach to balancing noble privileges with common welfare has attracted attention beyond our own borders. The scroll she held represented more than diplomatic correspondence. It was validation that their experiment in compassionate leadership had succeeded not just within their own territories, but had become a model that other rulers wished to emulate. The new royal seal they had commissioned, combining the traditional raven and crown with symbols representing the common folk they served, had become a mark of respect rather than mere authority. Bjorn accepted the scroll from his wife's hands, noting how natural the gesture had become, how seamlessly they had learned to share not just power, but the countless small decisions that shaped their daily governance. The document bore seals from 7 different kingdoms, all expressing interest in the policies that had transformed the Northern Territories from merely wealthy holdings into something approaching a just society. There is more, Svala continued, her eyes finding his across the small space between their chairs. The ambassadors specifically request to meet the man who gave up a quiet retirement to accept the burden of leadership, whose background in warfare and service to others has become legendary throughout the trading networks of the northern seas. The irony was not lost on either of them. Bjorn had sought obscurity in that small village, hoping to fade peacefully into the background of history. Instead, his willingness to offer ale to a stranger had led to a prominence he could never have imagined. His name now spoken with respect in royal courts across the known world. Rising from his chair, Bjorn felt the familiar weight of his father's sword at his side, not the ceremonial blade that protocol suggested he should wear, but the simple, honest weapon that reminded him daily of the principles that had guided him to this moment. Around the great hall, Conversations resumed in the easy manner of people who felt comfortable in their ruler's presence, who knew that their concerns would be heard and their welfare considered in every decision. "Perhaps," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall without need for shouting, "it is time we made a journey to the place where this all began. Our people should see that we have not forgotten our humble beginnings, and I confess, I find myself curious about how our former neighbors are faring." The suggestion was met with enthusiastic approval, particularly from those courtiers who had learned that their new ruler's unconventional approaches often led to surprisingly beneficial outcomes. But Bjorn was thinking beyond diplomacy or public relations. He was remembering the warmth of a simple fire, the taste of honest ale, the comfort of conversations unencumbered by the weight of political consequence, as preparations began for what would become a royal progress through the territories they now governed together. Svala approached him with something in her hands, a new leather pouch, skillfully crafted, but bearing the simple elegance that had become characteristic of their court's aesthetic. "For you," she said, her smile holding all the warmth of that first evening when he had offered her hospitality without thought of reward. Inside the pouch was a drinking horn, carved from silver greyhorn and decorated with scenes that told the story of their courtship. A warrior offering drink to a mysterious traveler, a chess game beneath ancient oaks, the exchange of rings. Carved from ice and fire, but it was the inscription around the rim that brought tears to his eyes. To Bjorn Ironshield, who proved that the greatest acts of courage are often the smallest acts of kindness. As they stood together in the great hall of Ironhold, surrounded by the evidence of what their partnership had accomplished, but preparing to return to the simple village where their love had taken root, both understood that they had discovered something more valuable than all the gold and silver in their treasury. They had found that true wealth lay not in what they could accumulate, but in what they could give to each other, to their people, and to the future that would be shaped by the choices they made together. The new royal seal gleamed in the afternoon, light streaming through the great hall's windows, its design a testament to the truth that the strongest foundations are built not on inherited privilege or accumulated power, but on the simple recognition that everyone, from the humblest farmer to the mightiest jarl, deserves leaders who understand that service to others is the highest form of strength. Outside, the northern winds carried the promise of winter, but inside the hall of Ironhold, warmed by the glow of honest governance and the satisfaction of duty well performed, two people who had found love through kindness prepared to return to the place where their greatest adventure had begun, with something as simple as sharing a drink with a stranger on a cold winter night.